So you know things are going bad for you when your enemy is actually laughing at your failures and your poor tactics on the battlefield.
Касается иностранных наемников, то они тоже несут значительные потери.
Большие.
Да, и
из-за своей тактики.
Из-за своей глупости.
Они ж кучками ходят. Да?
Во всяком случае, общественность стран, правительства которых посылают людей сегодня в зону боевых действий, общественность этих стран тоже должна знать о том, что там происходит. И мы будем доводить это до людей с тем, чтобы они давали оценку действиям своих правительств.
This video here is emblematic of the Ukrainian poor tactics and failures in the counteroffensive on the battlefield. So here the Ukrainians have switched tactics. They're no longer advancing in columns of armored vehicles and tanks because of the massive losses they've taken so far, which I've documented in my earlier videos, which amount to up to 20% loss of NATO equipment in the first week, another 10% in the following week. So now they are stopping short, dismounting on foot, and are preparing to attack fortified Russian positions without air support, without artillery support, without even mortars, in open fields. This is the 72nd Mechanized Brigade of the Ukrainian Armed Forces, and this is what Lukashenko and the President Putin were laughing about in the earlier clip. Take a look at how this offensive starts and then how it culminates.
Кто налегке? Берите раненых! Тяни! Доставите!
Ивана, сил нема на...
Вытягивайте его! Охранники! Берите раненых!
But according to certain US officials like David Petraeus and General Mark Milley, this was not supposed to be happening. They said that the Ukrainians were fully trained, properly equipped, several brigades have been training, and moreover, they said that it is the Russians who lack proper training. It is the Russians who are suffering from low morale, insufficient equipment, and that it was likely that this Ukrainian counteroffensive would sweep through Russian defense lines and succeed.
Need to watch is not what's happening on the battlefield right now. It's what's happening at training centers that U.S. runs in Germany, Grafenwehr-Hohenfels, UK, Poland, Ukraine itself, where entire new brigades are being established. The Ukrainians will have tanks with infantry and infantry fighting vehicles, keeping the enemy's infantry and their anti-tank guided missiles off those tanks. They will have air defense to keep the Russian air off them.
So the troops that are manning those Russian lines are poorly trained, poorly equipped. Their sustainment logistics is not high. The morale is low. And now recently, because of the Prigozhin mutiny, the command and control apparatus at the strategic level is certainly confusing at best and probably challenging in many, many other ways.
So when you listen as a critical observer to what these Western officials say and the contradiction to what is happening on the battlefield, I often asked myself, where do they get this reserve of propagandistic statements from? How do they come up with the constant creativity to make up these bold-faced lies and attribute them to the Russian army? Until I realized, especially arising out of the failures of this Ukrainian counteroffensive, that they are running an information war that I term propaganda by way of projection. In other words, everything that is wrong with the Ukrainian army, they issue statements and attribute it falsely to the Russian army. So let me give you an example. So let's look briefly at this article from Responsible Statecraft, and it was published on the 19th of July, and it was written by no other than U.S. Colonel Daniel L. Davies. So he's a military man. Listen to what he has to say. Last March, Secretary of Defense Lloyd Austin said that as a result of significant Western support, the Ukrainian military spring offensive had, in quotations, a very good chance of success. He then cites former Chief of the British General Staff, General Richard Dannat, who went so far as to suggest that Ukraine's offensive could be so successful that Putin, in quotations, may be swept out of the Kremlin as a result. And here's what Daniel Davis has to say about that. Combat reality, however, has now swept away those optimistic claims and exposed the harsh truth. Ukraine is unlikely to militarily evict Russia out of its territory, no matter how many men they feed into battle. That statement, I think, should dash all hopes of any Ukrainian victory in this war. No matter how many men they send, no matter how many weapons are delivered, Ukraine will not achieve its directives, its objectives, which is pushing Russia out of Ukraine and establishing pre-2014 borders. And if that cannot occur, then the Ukrainians cannot win. I want to examine some of these allegations made in the clips of General David Petraeus and General Mark Milley about low morale, poor training, and poor equipment in the Russian army. And I want to show you that these are really instances that are occurring currently in the Ukrainian army, not the Russian army. So this article is from the Kiev Post, a Ukrainian media outlet. It was published on the 22nd of July. And listen to the title. Every 100 meters cost 4 to 5 men. Ukraine's frontline fighters report bloody battles and, listen to this, battered morale. And here's the first paragraph. Frontline Ukrainian soldiers told Kiev Post their units are suffering from poor morale because of constant and accumulating losses, sometimes poor support, and limited offensive ground gains against a tough and deeply dug-in Russian opponent. So the Ukrainian troops are saying they, not the Russians, are suffering from poor morale, and they are also suffering from poor support, logistical support, poor equipment. So this is a Ukrainian soldier that was interviewed, and he said his unit soldiers are still willing to attack, but the ration of very little gained for fellow fighters killed or wounded was demoralizing. In 1 month, he said, we have only advanced 1.5 kilometers. We move forward by inches, but I don't think it's worth all the human resources and material that we have spent, the medic said. Now let's move on to a Western media article from the Wall Street Journal, and the title is Ukraine's lack of weaponry and training risks stalemate in fight with Russia, published the 23rd of July. And here's what the first paragraph says. When Ukraine launched its big counteroffensive this spring, Western military officials knew Kiev didn't have all the training or weapons, from shells to warplanes, that it needed to dislodge Russian forces, but they hoped Ukrainian courage and resourcefulness would carry the day. And not only that, that's not even all the problems the West face. I remember Biden made a comment that I thought, in his moment of clarity, amidst his declining cognitive abilities, he said that Putin came into Ukraine to break NATO.
I spent, as you know, a great deal of time trying to hold NATO together, because I believe Putin has had an overwhelming objective from the time he launched 185,000 troops into Ukraine, and that was to break NATO.
And I actually agreed with him that this war was not about Ukraine as much. It is about Ukraine, but it was a larger vision Putin had to break the NATO alliance, which has been constantly encroaching on Russia's borders. And there's evidence that Vladimir Putin is succeeding in demilitarizing NATO. So listen to this paragraph from the Wall Street Journal. But European militaries lack sufficient resources to supply Ukraine with all it needs to eject Moscow's armies from the roughly 20% of the country that they control. European leaders are also unlikely to significantly increase support for Kiev if they sense US reluctance, Western diplomats say. So NATO is running out of ammunition, and the support for this war is waning. You tell me who miscalculated in entering Ukraine? Russia, whose military-industrial complex has ramped up and is able to provide all the equipment necessary to sustain this attrition war, or NATO, who 1 year into this proxy war are running out of ammunition and equipment to send to Ukraine? So what is the end result of all of these lies and propaganda and failures of the Ukrainian army on the battlefield? Well, the Ukrainian counteroffensive is now turning into a Russian offensive. But before we get into it, if you like this content, please hit the subscribe button and help the algorithm boost this very new and young channel. And without further ado, let's get into it.
On the Kupiansk section of the front, our armed forces are advancing from the direction of the first Lyman. We managed to advance 3 kilometers to the eastern outskirts of Kupiansk and continue to dig into the enemy's defense. Basically, the front line in this whole area has been frozen perhaps for several months. And now our troops have concentrated a large-scale fist to continue the offensive. In general, according to Western experts and analysts, a grouping of the Russian armed forces of more than 100,000 people is concentrated along the entire section along the east of the Kharkiv region and the Donetsk People's Republic. This is probably one of the largest groupings on such a section of the front. I am talking about Kupiansk, Svatovo, and Kremenna. And now all these forces are trying to move forward.
And here's an article from El Arabia News confirming the buildup of Russian troops in preparation for an advance on the Kupiansk sector near Luhansk and Kharkiv oblasts. Russia has gathered more than 100,000 soldiers in the Liman and Kupiansk sector, and its troops have gone on the offensive, Ukrainian military said. In quotations, the Liman and Kupiansk direction, the enemy has concentrated a very powerful force, more than 100,000 personnel, more than 900 tanks, more than 555 artillery systems, 370 self-propelled guns. For scale, the largest number of Soviet troops in Afghanistan was only 120,000. The spokesman for the Eastern Military Command, Serhiy Cheravati, said, and now, some 5 days after these initial reports, it seems that the Russians are having success. They have established a bridgehead over the Oskil River, and they're expanding it, and it seems to be a shaping operation for a larger attack. Here's a brief clip from a war mapper on YouTube, who I trust to give credible information.
However, the situation completely changed a couple of days ago, as Russian forces, after discovering the weak spot in Ukrainian defensive line, decided to launch a probing attack. So as per report, Russian forces launched an attack westwards from Karmazanivka. To their surprise, they did find the weak spot, and were able to rapidly gain significant area. This advance was confirmed by both Ukrainian and Russian sources. Now, after gaining strategic insight on Ukraine's weak spot, Russian forces decided to launch a more substantial attack from the lower elevation area. Looking at the topographic map, you can see that Russian forces are located on lower elevation, while Ukrainian forces enjoyed their advantage of higher elevation. But despite the disadvantage, as per report, Russian forces were able to make significant advance. They were able to penetrate the Ukrainian defensive line a couple of kilometers in depth, and captured multiple higher elevation positions. This was also confirmed by both Ukrainian and Russian sources. After tasting major success, today Russian forces decided to launch a massive push on a broader front. As per report, they were attacking westwards from Kovalivka to Novovodiane. They were able to breach the Ukrainian defensive line and capture this huge area. It is said that the total advance is around 5 kilometers in depth. As you can see, Russian forces made a massive advance in 2 days. This advance includes the strategically important higher positions, notably one near Novohorivka. Consequently, the village is considered a gray zone. As you can see, the recent developments have given Russia strategic advantages, and they also have momentum in their favor. The capture of important locations gives them the option to launch further offensives. Currently, they are pushing across the entire front, which suggests that more advances might come.